So in the past 3 years here at IDOS, we have been studying how international migration and refugee norms are then translated into national refugee policies and laws, and how, or if at all, they are then put into practice at the regional and local level, meaning that they then meet the realities on the ground and the needs of refugee and migrants there. And a very recent and prominent example of an international framework is the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, the so-called CRRF, that calls for a deeper integration of refugees in hosting countries. And there are many countries that adopted this framework, and two prominent examples here are Kenya and Ethiopia, who are also pilot countries of that implementation. And with that signing, they received large international funds to implement the ideas of the CRF in their national laws. And we see that they have taken first steps and progress has been made in both of these countries. But then the progress of the further implementation has stalled. And we ask here why. So why is it not implemented and put further into practice? And to be perhaps a bit more specific, if we think about the case of Ethiopia, since the outbreak of conflict in the country, as well as ethnic tensions that have risen, the implementation just paused of the CRF. And we can also, as another example, look at the Somali refugees in Kenya, where we see an active non-integration and encampment of those refugee groups. That can be explained by the historical and regional geopolitical interests of Kenya.
We are mostly focusing on what countries are doing in terms of official policies, and we never really think about how host communities and the refugees are reacting to these policies. So our research shows the role of informality in terms of host countries and refugees coming together in these communities where the refugees live to decide on how to help each other. Most of the host communities are actually marginalized in so many cases. And because of this marginalization, they come together with the refugees and decide on how to work together, how to make life better for both communities. We need to consider the informality that takes place in host regions, the position that we often find in the literature that host communities are welcoming in the initial stages, and then with time they become resentful because refugees are receiving assistance and they are not. But we find in our research that some of the host communities also have these historical ties based on ethnicity, based on religion, based on business with the refugee communities. And this actually brings them together so that in the end, what we find is something that is influenced more by informality, what is happening on the ground, not exactly by the official refugee policy in the host country.
So in terms of national policies, we have kind of the informal policies and the challenges that come with working at the local level. But we also saw how national governments drew on their histories of managing displacement in the past and histories of political narratives around how migration and displacement fit into the political culture of the country. In Colombia, for example, the temporary protection status for Venezuelan refugees, in developing this process, Ivan Duque, the president at the time, played a significant role in bringing up the history of Venezuela hosting displaced Colombians and the role that Colombia plays in setting agendas for migration and displacement in international quarters. So these narratives, the political narratives and the historical narratives of countries are really important in how policies are shaped and adopted or not adopted at the local level. We also see similarly in Malaysia, the government speaks very much to the domestic audience. They don't receive donor funding. So in many ways, the way that the Malaysian government thinks about refugees and hosting refugees is very much in response to public opinion, and this leads to very different outcomes for example, the Syrian refugees who were hosted by Malaysia, who got very good treatment because there was a great deal of public sentiment in support of them, compared to the Rohingya, for whom there's very little public support and very little public sentiment, and thus the government has a much harder line in terms of how they treat Rohingya refugees in Malaysia.
When cities receive migrants, city authorities are tasked with the responsibility to provide services to migrants. But the challenge that we have with the implementation of migration policies is that migration policies are considered as the responsibility of nation states. And so city authorities don't necessarily have the authority required to deal on migration issues. Furthermore, we also find that another challenge with implementation is that city authorities and other city actors don't necessarily have access to direct funding sources. And so this limits their ability to address the needs of migrants within the cities. And so it's important for policy makers to consider how cities can have access to direct funding, but also be involved in the design of policies and programs from the beginning. So in the implementation of migration policies, especially when we consider the intersection with issues such as climate change, lack of capacity limits their ability to provide services to migrants. And so it's important that there are investments in capacity building for actors in the city level. Also, it's important for cities to have the opportunity to engage in knowledge exchanges to fill gaps in knowledge on the intersection of climate change and migration in order to be effectively able to implement migration policies and climate migration policies in general.